Welcome to Sheth Marketing Academy. This lecture is on leading by doing, and of course more appropriate title will be execution. As you know, one of the major books in management that sold very well by Basidi and Ramcharan, one consultant, one CEO of a large company at GE and Honeywell, etc. They came out with the idea that what matters most is execution, not strategic planning. There is always a cycle for all these ideas. In the 80s, which was a major restructuring of American corporations, the shareholder value was deteriorating. We had stagflation, highest inflation with no growth. Economists never thought it can ever happen because inflation comes from growth is the theory, and large diversified companies such as General Electric or Beatrice Foods in Chicago or CBS or any one of those, as they had diversified, had collapsed. Since we have the equity to debt ratio 1:1 roughly we keep, since the equity declined, the ratio became more risky, maybe 1:2, 2.5, and in the process you have to therefore borrow money because it's more risky venture now at higher interest rates. By the way, that was the time we also discovered junk bonds, where the corporations had to pay 14-15% interest because during stagflation of late 74, 78, early 80, the prime interest rate alone was 10-11%. Michael Milken, you might remember the name, became the pioneer inventing what is called junk bonds, which means large companies can borrow at high interest rates because they are more risky, the ratings are lower, but they can still borrow to survive. This was the time when we had private equity people making plays for large corporations, like KKR buying out R.J. Reynolds and I guess Nabisco. I mean, it happened across the board. Prior to that one, the belief in the country was that the more diversified you are, a conglomerate or a business group, the better off you are because you can manage risk yourselves. You are a holding company into as many diversified businesses as possible, from consumer products to consumer services to industrial products, industrial services. And Beatrice Foods was a great example because they originally had La Choy chow mein, Yoplait yogurt on a license basis probably, and they diversified all through the 60s and the 70s so that they were into the rust proofing business by buying out Rusty Jones as a rust proofing company. They were actually making the Lego toy and built a factory to make that toy and got a license to do that thing. They were in industrial chemicals, just went on and on. And this was a perfect play for private equity people because it's a no-brainer. If I take the control of the company and all you need is 5 to 10% equity interest, I can take control. Either I work with the management if they're willing to listen, or get rid of them pretty much, and the breakup value alone would be more than the total value of the company. It was a no-brainer. And so you had Bain Capital that came, for example, KKR, as I mentioned earlier, Warren Buffett on the more benevolent private equity entity, etc. And that's the time when strategic planning, which used to be the framework created by Shell company, created by General Electric, for example. At General Electric, I'm told they had more than 100 full-time employees strictly in that strategic planning department. And they will allocate capital, they will allocate career pathing of talented managers, and that came to a screeching halt with this restructuring that was taking place. And that is the time when General Electric, like Jack Welch and Basidi, as well as Ramcharan, who has been their advisor, began to say what matters more for the company is execution and not planning. That's the background. So let's go through this journey now. I've given the title Leading by Doing. And the fundamental shift in business leadership, as I mentioned, has been going from diversified business groups or conglomerates to more and more focusing on a core business and divesting or selling off or whatever you do. And we had lots of mergers, acquisitions. In fact, during the Reagan administration, we had mega mergers, and the size, total dollar amount, exceeded much greater than all of European Union mergers, acquisitions, as countries began to give up their borders. So I can easily move from France to Germany, Germany to Italy, etc., etc., and companies began to buy other companies and consolidate. So that's one dimension. And as I mentioned, from strategy was the key area. In fact, during that time in the 80s, we came out with frameworks like Boston Consulting Group Framework, which was a strategy framework. We came out, in fact, with strategic planning process, and all this stuff came to a screeching halt. What the CEO wanted was survival, and what he wanted was execution, execution, execution. No more debates. It's almost like autocratic democracy. Now, why did it happen? And we touched upon one of them. With the stagflation, shareholder value was declining. You have a great set of companies with a great set of assets. So the whole became less than sum of parts. And therefore, the very simple thing is I can easily deliver 30-40% return on my investors as a private equity person. Remember, this is before the rise of mutual funds, or what we call now the hedge funds. So private equity became a big play. And they would come, take over the company, break up them, sell, and in 2-3 years they can get more return than anybody else. We also had experienced globalization of competition. Till the late 60s, early 70s, competition was much more domestic all over the world, and including in the US. So we had companies like Goodyear, Firestone, Goodrich dominating the tire business. We had a General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler dominating the automobile business. Just went on and on. I can give you all the examples. Aerospace industry, Boeing, McDonnell Douglas, Lockheed. We just dominated. Foreign competition was minimal. This is the time when foreign competition began to emerge successfully. We had the early days of the automobile people who came from Europe, British economy, and most of them died here. Renault died, Peugeot died, for example. Volkswagen just made a small success, but successful history of Volkswagen, when you analyze the data, never had more than 3-4% market share. More like a specialty niche company, essentially. But now the competition became very serious. From Japan primarily, eventually Korea in the 90s, and today this is a reality. If you believe the Japanese competition had an enormous impact on the US economy, and Korean competition has some impact, going forward, China factor is very key. Some of the largest corporations across all industries, steel, iron ore, technology, cellular telephones, appliances, it's a matter of time before the largest corporations will be of Chinese origin. Primarily because China now has a huge domestic market scale that is unprecedented, just like India. At one time when Chinese were strictly exporting American-made products in China for low labor cost, but the brands were all American, future is just the opposite. Where the Chinese brands will start rising, we will globally accept them, and the competition from the Asian conglomerates or Asian companies is going to be a lot more brutal than the competition we have so far experienced from Japan and Korea, or before that one from Europeans. The third factor, and a very key one, is absolutely increasing uncertainty. In other words, we have two sets of uncertainties. One, the uncertainty about the policy of the governments. Most governments seem to be paralyzed in the political process. That's true of European Union, that's true of America, that's true of Japan. These are the three largest economies in terms of the world GDP. And of course, we see the same problem with policy as well as economy. There is no growth, so it increases the uncertainty about the future, and the uncertainty by definition requires therefore higher risk payment or higher return on that risky future by and large, and everybody wants to guard themselves in the process. And the last one is a very interesting area. All of a sudden, now we have become very computerized. You know, in the early days, we only automated manufacturing. So we put robots and computers in factories. In the late 70s or so, we began to automate clerical workers. Remember steno pools? I used to have a department where we had 11 steno pools that typed all the exams, that typed papers of the faculty, and you had this blue stencil, as we call it, and they rolled over a machine called mimeograph. That's gone. We have no more anybody who is a typist or a shorthand dictation. It is just one receptionist. Everybody does their own sort of the clerical appointment, etc. Now, the highest wage paid are the most educated people, professional category, managerial category, and they are going to be automated pretty soon. While it's bad news on the one hand, it is a good news in the sense that today the CEO of a very large enterprise, 40, 50, 60 billion dollars, has a pulse about his or her own organization through, let's say, BlackBerry, social media, Facebook, Twitter, etc. Remember, most CEOs are not comfortable yet, but it's a matter of time before they will get used to it also. So I found that leading by doing is becoming more a necessity, because if you don't change with the times, you are likely to collapse. So good companies fail. I never thought good companies will ever fail. Good companies fail when they are either unable or unwilling to adopt their culture, corporate culture, their processes, the way they did business, and their structure, the way they are organized, when the external forces have changed dramatically or permanently. We have seen this with steel. We used to dominate steel industry till the early 80s. I mean, US Steel, Bethlehem, Jones and Lockling, you know, just one of 5 big steel companies control 70–80% of the capacity. That's not there. Aluminum, world-class companies like Alcoa are having some difficulty right now. But the second largest aluminum company now is Novelis, which is the Alcan, which is the Canadian part of the Alcoa after the divestiture or breakup of the aluminum industry by law or by government, just like the breakup of the Standard Oil companies. Alcan went private equity, could not compete, and it is now sold to an Indian company. The division is called Hindalco, and the parent group company is called Aditya Birla Group. The same Aditya Birla Group, ABG, just bought Columbia Chemicals in Atlanta, and now they are number 1 or number 2 in carbon black worldwide. Very industrial, raw material kinds of things. So aluminum, which we used to dominate the world, does not look like we can sustain in the future. We can always become a specialty aluminum, specialty niche, specialty steel. My experience has been with television. I mean, we used to make television. We invented, we commercialized, we lost it. How many of you remember brand names like RCA, Zenith, or General Electric? They're all gone. If there are brands like that in the marketplace, they're basically manufactured by somebody, and the branding is there for retailing marketing or existing distribution. Same thing happened with the watch industry. Timex used to be undisputed leader, gone. Kodak, undisputed leader in the film business, gone. And I found out Digital Corporation, who was unwilling to change, the same founder who created a world-class company, unfortunately was so strong in his belief, Ken Olsen was his name. He never thought PCs can ever replace mainframe computers, and he refused to listen to anybody. And within 25 years or so, the same founder, after a successful growth of a great company competing against IBM in mini computers, suddenly has gone. IBM went through the same thing where they were unable to change because the processes, the bureaucracy, the culture had taken over, and they had to bring somebody from outside to bring about a change, Lou Gerstner. Sears right now is struggling. General Motors had to declare Chapter 11. Hopefully it will come out now. Kodak, which I already talked about. So I have written a book which is not the main point of this presentation here, called The 7 Bad Habits of Good Companies. Now we talk about the 7 good habits of effective people, but there is the other side. The book title is Self-Destructive Habits of Good Companies, because companies with success learn and acquire bad habits just as we do as human beings. So the book articulates bad habits like denial, arrogance, complacency, competitive myopia, turf fights inside, etc., etc. So on the next slide you can see there are several styles of leadership. The one style of leadership would be the legacy, continue as you have done in the past rather than bring about a change. In that case you are going downward. It's called status quo management, and obviously you can survive in the future. Any intervention does not seem to wake up the company or their people. In the short run, there is a crisis management, as many companies are experiencing in America, not just in the financial institutions. So you go in a survival mode, and the leadership you need is somebody who will survive the company. Cost cutting, whatever it is. In the 80s, that happened to Bridgestone, the tire company number 2 in America. And the only way you can cut cost is what? How can you cut the cost fastest? The internal management will never do it, because they have grown up with the company, they are loyal to everybody, they became the head primarily because they performed better or they had a good mentor, but they know there are many talented people, so they don't have the guts to do the cost cutting. So the best way and the fastest way to do cost cutting is to bring an outside CEO, either one of the board members who is a CEO of another company to take over, or hire somebody who has a knack of doing cost cutting. Of course, private equity people are famous for that. So in that case you bring in, and he or she begins to transform the company if possible. I call it a crisis management. You might remember Rubbermaid was one of those companies. Al Dunlop came from outside, and of course he had other problems. He was basically actually not an ethical person. And similarly, they brought in Jack Nevin, I think was the name, for Bridgestone. It's only a short-term game on the way to the exit. So you dress up the company right, and people are willing to pay better price. It's a shareholder-driven completely. In fact, in the 80s, shareholder value became the obsession, not just a mantra, and grew enormously because of the toughness of the situation. Today, the attitude is that we need to execute, execute, execute. We have a very good, we talk a lot, but we don't deliver. We promise a lot to the customers, to the employees, to the suppliers, but somehow we are not able to meet those promises or exceed those promises. In fact, the trust of the corporations by all stakeholders is at the lowest point ever. The community, the suppliers, the employees, and even customers just don't trust companies for whatever reason. We don't want to go into the analysis or the cause and effect and all this stuff, but I'm saying that's the reality. And this is the time when, because of those 4 factors, there's a lot more pressure on the CEO to say, focus on the company, don't do golf and lunches except with customers, don't sit on other boards. In fact, most CEOs are now mandated to not sit on any other board except maybe one NGO at best. That's a game you do after retirement, not while you are an active CEO. Very strong message is given by the analyst or activist shareholders that your job is not just whining and dining and making extra money as board members and traveling. Your job is to manage your own business. That is called the execution leadership. It is also a transformation leadership, which means when the CEO takes charge, chairman, CEO as a combination job in the US, it's a hands-on, and hence it's leading by doing. And the job of the CEO and the chairman is to break 4 major legacy issues. Culture is one. How do you transform the culture? Processes is another one. GE has focused on processes, for example. Systems, structure, which is the organizational design. And I've added a 5th one here, regulation, because often regulation constrains. In fact, there is no free market economy. When we talk about free market economy, we mean pricing is not intervened by a regulator, except in monopolies like utilities, where prices are governed by the government or the regulator, like public service commissions or whoever the regulators are. However, every industry and company is regulated by safety standards, environmental protection agency standards, employee welfare standards, affirmative action programs, encouraging diversity, just goes on. There is a lot of regulation, and sometimes a company or the industry finds that regulation which was designed with good intention some time ago, 30, 40, 50 years ago, has a legacy of its own. It is obsolete. You need to rewrite the legislation. So something in regulation or policy might be a better word that the CEO has to engage himself or herself, right? So here are some examples where this kind of an active hands-on intervention brought about a transformation from before to after, from survival to success. IBM, great company, had become legacy, unable to change, as I mentioned, unlike digital, which was unwilling to change. And IBM had to bring an outside CEO who had no knowledge of technology. Lou Gerstner, he came from packaged goods industry and transformed the company altogether. So today, company, in fact, in the Interbrand survey of the most valuable brands, Coca-Cola is still way ahead. Apple is number 2 now, but the number 3 corporate brand or a brand is IBM, which is unthinkable, doing exceptionally well in this very large and very competitive industry, and transforming the industry from a product driven to more and more a services driven, or from a technology driven to more and more customer driven. Coca-Cola, Warren Buffett invested, divested all the peripheral businesses back into the core business and grow the core business even though it's mature, go into emerging markets like China, India, Brazil, Mexico, etc. And you saw the valuation from $4 billion in 1 decade alone, $100 billion, working with the CEO, Roberto Goizueta. So in this case, the investor or the board member representing investors and the CEO works together to transform the organization. And if you look at these people like Lou Gerstner or Sam Palmisano, they're hands-on people. They monitor minutest details. They're very much understanding everything about finances, everything about operations, everything about psychology of people. So you need a hands-on, a doer essentially as the CEO, as opposed to CEO just doing visioning, strategic planning and simply saying, I delegate and others take care of it. Harley Davidson is a turnaround the same way, which you all know in the motorcycle business. It's a great company, great brand, and has been able to transform, almost coming out of bankruptcy pretty much, with the competition from the Japanese like the Honda, or from the BMW even in the motorcycle business, Kawasaki, just went on and on. So how do you lead by doing? Ultimately, how to is a very key thing. So here are about 10 points. The first one is take charge. It's not a Politburo, please. It's not a committee or a management team. You are in charge, everybody knows you are in charge. Like a presidency of United States. or a governor of a state. You are a CEO of a state enterprise. So take charge. And Jack Welch did that, a company that was driven by strategic planning and corporate staff people. He fired all of them. And he basically said, I need the doers management committee. All the direct reports, they met and totally executed. And Ram Charan was the advisor, and as the book he wrote with Cassidy, obviously has done very, very well. It resonates with people under tough times. And by the way, GE before the transformation was a conglomerate, maybe 100, 200 subsidiaries easily, had become plateaued, complacency had come in. So they actually recruited a young person 3 levels below the senior management, gave up the traditional succession planning where the president becomes the CEO, CEO becomes the chairman and all the stuff, and picked up a young guy who was absolutely competent. He's a PhD in chemicals engineering, but also had the toughness. In fact, there were headlines in Business Week and Fortune and Forbes magazines. He was called Neutron Jack. Buildings are intact, people are dead. That was his image. Of course, he transformed himself in the process by doing leadership role, and that's a very key one. So take charge. Second one, it's not enough to take charge, but you must know your people and your customers. And that is where on the biography written by Lou Gerstner about his experiences at IBM, it is uncanny to see how first thing he did was to go to the highest R&D technical people in Armonk and say, without you there is no company. Those are the powerful people. So he learned how to do internal marketing. But that doesn't bring about a change. So he brought in customers in every discussion, made the company from a technology driven to a customer centric company. And again, as we said, great transformation was made of IBM. Third, my favorite is insist on realism. I tell you, sitting on the boards of companies, I find great rationalization after the fact, especially for not delivering performance. But even for succeeding sometimes, management always wants to rationalize after the fact what happened. So it's not realism, it is basically rationalization. So you take Good to Great Companies by Jim Collins, did exceptionally well. And if you analyze the companies he selected who delivered better shareholder value than the stock market or S&P 500, the most common denomination among all those companies was that the CEO was a hands-on person. So how do you get more greatness out of a company, which is good, requires heavy intervention or transformation. Expand the capability of people, which I think is another very key. All of us have more potential than we realize. In fact, motivation speakers will tell you we never ever use more than 10-15% of our potential. Journey is quite a lot. So transformation companies have decided or have figured out how to invest in increasing capabilities of people, not just promotion tenure. So they become lot more capable of handling the business of tomorrow rather than the business of today or yesterday. So generally this requires what is called action learning. Noel Tishy, as a good consultant, a good professor at Columbia University, coined the phrase. We says that as we go through transformation workshops and seminars, make sure that they are given a project which is a live, real issue of the company, and based upon how they solve the project, career path is basically articulated for you. So that is the next area. Develop a process-based culture. This is my favorite. I think we depend too much, especially in capitalistic societies like the US, where we have almost autocratic democracy, as I've been calling. We need to have institutionalization. Therefore, the shadow of one person that reflects the company is not there when that person retires or that person moves on. I mean, we have seen this problem at Yahoo. We have seen this problem at HP, for example. I mean, how many CEOs have come and gone? because the processes are still legacy. So, key emphasis here would be to make the culture of the company less people oriented and more process oriented. And Toyota is a classic example, because Toyota, as you know, accepted 4 processes for manufacturing or anything now called lean operations or lean, and that is TQM, quality management, that includes mass customization, just-in-time inventory or cycle time, and of course, one more area that I don't remember right now, but there are 4 processes that put together as an integrated framework to not only improve the quality, but do it faster, cheaper, better, as it is called. Next one is reward the doers, and this is one that I have personal experience, I must tell you. I found lots of great managers who are absolutely brilliant at PowerPoint presentations, articulating the future of the company, the strategy, but when you look at the performance, it's very low. So, what you have to do is to identify people who have a much higher do to say ratio or much lower say to do ratio. In other words, they don't say anything unless they mean it and get it done. You need to understand how to reward them, which is different than rewarding, for example, based upon seniority or based upon rotation or whatever HR people do. That's very key in my view. Reward the doers, we have seen that at Southwest Airlines in a more democratic way. We have seen at Oracle in a more autocratic way. Doesn't matter what style of management, but ultimately the reward should go to people who deliver whatever objectives and the results company is expecting, and letting them go if they can't perform. Also giving them a chance once. I don't like this view that failure is good thing. Once, yes, but I've seen managers who are a chronic failure. No matter what job you give them, they don't succeed. There should be no need to tolerate them. In that case, again, it looks like entitlement, either by seniority or entitlement by, let's say, union negotiations or whatever the reason is. So, you must have, therefore, reward the doers, not the sayers. Relentless follow through, which means after making a statement or giving a command, you really follow through as a CEO to say, did people carry out what you asked them to do? And I'm told Roberto Gozzietta was great at this stuff. I mean, if there was a comment by any analyst which did not make sense, he persisted, communicated, provided more information to make sure that the analyst had both sides of the coin, both types of messages, company perspective as well as the investor perspective. Next one is invest in online enterprise systems. I'm becoming more and more convinced that the ultimate DNA of a company is not as much culture, as much process, even organizational design, but IT systems. The more companies will invest into IT systems, now web-based primarily, the more flexible or the more adaptable the companies will become. And as I said, the only reason good companies fail is when they are either unable or unwilling to change, when the external environment has changed. So, invest in online enterprise systems, and this is not a one-time investment capital. It is also an ongoing upgrade of the enterprise systems by and large, whatever they are. Leading by doing. And by the way, back to that enterprise system, I would say the success of SAP was exactly that. Even though we had the IBM, you had the Oracle, who are very big into legacy operating systems, but SAP was the first one to say, let me integrate. So, integrated enterprise is the future. Next one is reorganized around customers or markets. I like the word customers than markets. So, in B2B or industrial markets, you have a handful of customers, especially if you are a supplier to an OEM manufacturer like a Caterpillar or a General Motors or a Boeing. I mean, most of your business goes to one or two accounts. You can have a very one-on-one relationship in the process. Take the customer perspective, create a profit center around each account, not around products. And we have seen this transformation at Procter & Gamble, which was a product-centric, decentralized P&L across different product lines, coffee to detergent to cosmetics to medicine or whatever they do. And they learned their biggest customer was Walmart. They never thought about that. It was actually Walmart who woke them up and say, we are your largest customer and your processes, your terms and conditions are so oppressive, it creates inefficiency for us as we get your products in the warehouses and distribute them into our retail stores. So if you don't work with us and learn from us, we'll probably not patronize you. And that was a whole transformation of Procter & Gamble to create a separate key account management, as Coca-Cola has on the fountain side. The largest customer always has been McDonald's, for example. So McDonald's, airlines, they're all B2B customers. Key account is the key process. Now it is called a global account management. And the last one is the relationship managers that we have seen clearly in banking sector, financial services, wealth management, where you have one person who takes care of their own internal procedures, bureaucracies, etc., and bonds with the customer. So organize around customers. Become an integrated enterprise, as I mentioned. That one was the IT context, but in general, you have to behave like one company no matter how diversified you are. And it's not just branding, it's the culture. And that was what you sense when you go to an Indian company called Tata Group, probably $75–80 billion. They're into every business you can imagine, from water to 5-star luxury hotels, to automobiles, to steel, to locomotives, anything. I mean, just there's nothing that they cannot do. And they become global now through acquisitions like buying out Cora Steel in England, buying out, in fact, Tetley Tea, for example, and become number 2 tea company, etc. So become integrated enterprise as you diversify. Very important. You cannot have a holding company architecture where you are an internal bank, which is the old model where the strategic planning group at the corporate level says we will allocate the capital to different divisions, we'll starve some divisions, we invest in others and steer the whole big ship toward the future. This says no, we will have a team of managers who will sit on the boards of every subsidiary or a company and come out with a common culture at the corporate level. And by the way, Tata is a good example for another thing. It is very much like Berkshire Hathaway. I don't think even Berkshire Hathaway is the right model. At the holding company level, where you have an integrated culture and a belief system, you should not be listed in the stock market. Each of the subsidiaries could be listed where you have an ownership. So Tata and Sons is just a private capital company, but with management, not just capital, unlike private equity people where only provide capital and not as much management. So in conclusion, companies are increasingly restructuring themselves from diversified businesses to highly focused businesses. You may be in the same industry, let's say Procter & Gamble in consumer packaged goods, but you divest Crisco, you divest Folgers Coffee, whatever it is, and focus on one core business. Or you are Abbott Laboratories, or you are, let's say, Kraft Foods, you do the same thing. And from strategic planning approach to execution. Those are the 2 dimensions. This is happening because there is a much greater breakup value of the company, which means if I sell each piece, I get more value than the combined company listed in the stock market. Globalization of competition, especially the China factor, as I mentioned, is so serious. You've got to protect yourself. There's a huge increasing uncertainty from a politics viewpoint. And now, as the CEO, you have access and a pulse about everybody through social media, such as a Twitter or a Facebook, etc. The point I'm making is that if you look at the data in 2012, the amount of cash on the balance sheets of the companies I'm told, has exceeded $2 trillion. Why? It's earning nothing. So typical investment analyst would criticize that you are having unproductive resources like gold. But the companies are keeping that not as much for managing the uncertainty in the future as making big plays like the 80s. Mark my words, after the elections in 2012 in America, you will see massive mergers, acquisitions to a level we would not have imagined, similar to what happened after the first energy crisis when under Reagan administration we allowed open mergers of peer groups, essentially same industry, and ignored antitrust laws for the sake of global competitiveness. You're going to have the same buzzwords, same kind of a commission that will happen where the government tacitly with the industry will allow the survival, if not the thriving, of the American corporations. That's really what's happening. I did want to make a comment about social media. Unfortunately, we are all a fish in a digital fishbowl. You have to use social media very carefully. One of the consequences of social media is that the world is no longer polite. Have you seen the cuss words on the internet? People in the anonymity of internet or social media are willing to say anything in their mind. They don't have a forethought. They don't have a control of what they say. Interestingly, people who are lifelong friends teeing up some idea or some controversy, getting comments from other friends, get into a tussle, and ultimately friendship ends. You can't afford that with your customers or with your suppliers or even with your employees. Corporations are more complex that way. So you have to use this technology in a more smarter, careful way. We have this theory called too big to fail. I don't buy that. Too big to fail is a mirage, my view. We have had these theories before when we came out with a concept of natural monopoly, where some economist even teed up the idea that a single company will have more efficiency and effectiveness than 2 or 3 companies. So we allowed monopolies to telephone companies, utility companies based on that theory. Now we find that that's not really the right way. Same thing, too big to fail is not a reality. It's just a mirage. Good companies, irrespective of the size and scope, fail if they are either unable or unwilling to change when their external forces like globalization, technology, competition, customers even, capital markets have changed dramatically or permanently. Leading by doing is not an option, therefore it is a necessity. Leading by doing will require taking charge. Everybody knows who is in charge here, like a command, control, coordination of the military. Knowing your customers and employees, developing process-based culture, rewarding the doers, investing in online enterprise systems, and integrating functions across businesses. I hope you have enjoyed this lecture. Thank you very much.